Societies in decline have always, as far as I've been able to determine, suffered in the masculine sphere. This is simple to track within monarchies as succeeding generations of kings and emperors become increasingly effeminate, with a reactionary phase of ultra-masculine revival, often signaling a last gasp of the culture, writes James LaFond in his book Masculine Axis. In modern America, as periods of apathy and obedience to a corrupt order marked by low amounts of violence burst forth suddenly with outbreaks of violent episodes, such as the Baltimore and Ferguson riots in recent years, it is becoming increasingly clear that the system is less and less responsive to the everyday needs of ordinary people, and acting more like a rapid response team in order to quell dissent. The police are there to keep those riots contained, those employed at work, producing, consuming, and paying their taxes, and those who decide to drop out from getting too much traction in the market for ideas. Those in the middle, who cling to their aspirations of becoming members of the elite, are the least free, as they can always be bribed to do the bidding of those at the top. To quote Fight Club author Chuck Palahniuk, however, only after we've lost everything are we free to do anything.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
The military-industrial complex.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time to be a
На полный разгром гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Myth20 Century. This is a very special episode where we're going to be doing an interview with a very special guest, James LaFond. He's lived in Baltimore most of his life, and he's an author of close to 100 books, most notably Logic of Steel, among many others. The interesting story about how I came to James's attention was someone on our Twitter channel, Mike, 49867945. Thanks, buddy. He recommended James to us. And coincidentally, he had actually come on to the Rebel Yell show, which most of us are fans of. And he did a great interview. And so I checked him out. And he's also been on the Two Kevins, Grace and Steel podcast, as well as a recurring podcast he does with Lynn Lockhart called the Crackpot Podcast. And James is a fighter. He's an author. And like I mentioned, a longtime Baltimore resident, so he saw firsthand the riots in 2015 with Freddie Gray, and he wrote a book about that called War Drums. So to start us off, I'd like to read a passage from his book, Thriving in Bad Places. This is from a section called The Wrong Side of the Tracks. I was 20 or 21, and it was late 1997 or early 1998. And I was at a friend's parents' house that lived in a wealthy suburb, but it just so happened that the nearest Blockbuster Video happened to be in a really ghetto area called Chester, Pennsylvania. It's amazing how quickly neighborhoods can turn, sometimes quite literally as you cross the train tracks. Anyway, it was less than 5 miles drive from my friend's parents' 500,000 plus home in one of the best school districts in state to this terrible ghetto area where the video store was. It was around 7 or 8 at night, dark because it wasn't in the summer, but not late at night at all. I went with my friend to rent a video, or maybe it was a game, and it's just as I had entered the car, but before I started the engine, I heard a tap on the glass and looked up to see a snub-nosed revolver. The handle was wrapped in tape and are rubber bands, and there was a clearly black male wearing a ski mask telling me to get out of the car. Terrified, having never looked down the barrel of a gun before, I complied. So James, what do you do when that happens?
I hope you don't get shot. It's a done deal. That's the whole point. The whole point of using that illustration. I back it up in the book and demonstrate how you don't go there. The people that use guns to stick other people up, they're actually engaged in an attempt to minimize the violence that they have to do to get what they want. So they're pretty easy to avoid compared to some other types, which is a good thing, but you have to know what to look for. But where he's at right there, He just needs to do anything but go somewhere with that guy. If that guy wants you to go somewhere with him, he's going to kill you anyhow. So he might as well shoot you while you're running.
Is this something that happens a lot in that area? It's Chester, Pennsylvania.
Those types of stick-ups, actually, I coach a group of guys that live around there. And those type of stick-ups are more common in the area that's described, where there's a tiny ghetto somewhere, and those people can use it as the hub of a wheel of opportunity to go out and prey on others. And if you actually go into their hub, then you're automatically prey. Then you get fingered more quickly than you would in another environment.
How do they spot you? Like what is a tell to them that you're
white? Target? Number one is you're white. Okay, you're white, then you're probably a victim. You're probably a good candidate for victimhood if you're white.
Because you won't fight back, you don't know how to fight, you got money. What do you think is going through your head?
The big thing is most white folks, and I was raised this way, are conditioned to seek civility and to negotiate.
Right.
They're not conditioned to the predatory mindset. So the person doesn't, you're looking for somebody that is not playing your game. Best of all, you're looking for somebody that doesn't even know you're in their game and that they're being played. You want somebody that is clueless. Right. So you go after a white person primarily for that reason.
Now,
American.
Real quick, we wanted to talk about Fight Club a little bit because everybody wants to know what your opinion of that movie is. But have you seen Training Day? This was with Denzel Washington.
Yes, I did. I like Training Day.
Yeah, great movie. Yeah, and this reminds me of the scene where those rich kids drive into the ghetto to score some weed, and that's like the first scene where Ethan Hawke sees what Denzel's all about. He basically just pulls a gun on these kids and says, "Hey, you think you're tough? Show me what you got." Yeah, and that was the Training Day break-in. But I mean, it's just a different planet. I don't know how people think they can wander into this territory and play by these same rules. This reminds me of another thing, real quick, Hans, and then please go ahead. But I was watching some videos from Baltimore, and there's a guy. He got kind of famous because he's a quasi whistleblower on the Baltimore PD, and you may or may not know who he is. I'm not really clear on if I completely trust him. He's a young kid.
Interviewed by Rogan?
Yeah, Mike Woods, you know who I'm talking about?
Okay, it's the only time I've gotten angry on my website. I would strangle that guy if I met him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and this is a ex-cop, and us on the show we're somewhat skeptical of the police system, but basically he just completely slams it, and he's, to me, I mean, you should all check out his work and let him speak for himself, but my rough impression was that this kid was basically saying, all cops are crooked and the captain's out there to get you, to arrest people, to get the numbers up, and there's no justice.
I'm not familiar with this. What was the, James, you objected to what this guy was saying?
Okay, this guy, as he described himself, he came back from the military. He wanted adventure, so a little Iraq in the form of Baltimore sat right south of his cozy Baltimore County location. He's a suburban brat, and he comes into town to work on the Baltimore City Police Department, and he starts feeling guilty because they're rousting corners and blocks of black guys all the time, and this is under what remained of Norris's old system, where you go after people for all kinds of petty stuff in hopes that you're going to catch up somebody that's got a warrant out for him, or you're going to bag some kingpin while he's drinking a 40 of malt liquor or something and get him on that charge and bust him inside. Now, he ends up feeling so guilty about this that he starts arresting random white people, by his admission, just to assuage his guilt. Okay. And then eventually his guilt gets so bad that he becomes this advocate for the black criminal class, and the cops to him are now all bad. Now, mind you, this faggot is living off of Baltimore City. He separated his shoulder in a car accident, and he's living on disability. This guy's 30 years old. I was hurt worse than this guy when I was 27. And I've been busting my ass working in supermarkets all the way up to this year, and I'm 54. And this faggot's already driving around as a full-time grievance, justice person, and he's being financed by the tax base that I pay into. And I'm not a friend of the Baltimore City Police, okay? But this guy represented 30% of the bad cops. And then he decided to become a whistleblower, and he's trying to paint all the cops as bad. But only about a third of them are rotten.
Yeah, if you go to his...
This dude actually got me angry. I'm sorry.
No. I completely
I don't usually get angry.
It.
It's out of character for me.
I feel you, because what I hate the most is somebody who's going to take a little example, blow it up out of proportion, and use it as their own little self-promotion platform. I really despise these people. These are politicians, basically. This is the trait of a politician, in my opinion. And
He's done some videos cruising around Baltimore.
Yeah.
You can find them on YouTube.
Hans, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if you go... I just went to this guy's website. I've never heard of this dude. First of all, his website sucks. He should kill his web dev. Secondly, he has like a contact form for, inquiries, comments, and media/booking. Subscribe for updates. Give your email address to me. Like, this dude, he's wearing like a Young Turks t-shirt. Yeah, I would strangle this guy too if I ever saw him on the street. I mean,
what's interesting to me about like this dynamic is that like he's substantively basically correct, like, but it doesn't necessarily matter, and he's using his sort of like endorsement of this as a way to make a buck for himself. Like, you can talk about a third of the cops being corrupt, and it's like, okay, well then the other 2/3 are evidently supporting, at least passively, the third who are actively bad or dirty or abusive or whatever. And the system as a whole is kind of designed to accommodate both of those proportions, like to make it easy enough to go along to get along, as long as you're achieving the sort of objectives of the system as a whole. And the sort of like interplay between the kind of like social justice, very like politicized unwillingness to establish actual control of like a very unruly population. It plays off perfectly in this kind of dialectic with the desire actually to enforce some sort of order. Like, you really can't have either side of that without the other one. So, I mean, this guy might be like a piece of shit, but, I don't ultimately think he's like kind of, I don't think that like you can say like, okay, this guy's a piece of shit, therefore like, support your local police department or whatever.
I agree.
The anti-white stuff is where it's like, okay, so you felt like you needed to go around and deliberately harass white people to assuage your guilt. Like, doesn't that make you a corrupt cop? Doesn't that compromise any sort of upstanding moral authority that you should be embodying as a police officer? Just like this, it's a total joke.
Yeah, I mean, I'll don the full bow tie and say that, like, there's nothing about like being like a avatar of any sort of governing apparatus that makes you a beacon of moral authority. Like, that's not a thing.
I was really trying to be as objective as possible without actually knowing what the hell I'm talking about, because I don't live in Baltimore, and James does, and that was kind of my conclusion, frankly, after going over a lot of numbers. Hans was helpful before the show, and he found a crime stat that said there's about 500 property crimes per 10,000 crime rate in Baltimore. Just as I think it's 5,000 per 10,000 people. Is that right?
So, going off of the like on Wikipedia, they have the 2015 crime rates, and the total property crime is 4,980.4 per 100,000 people.
Okay, so
yeah,
so that's about 500 per 10,000.
Right.
And so the benchmark that I've looked at for kind of a normal place where the demographics aren't, let's say like Baltimore's, is about 100 per 10,000. So we got maybe a 5 times X multiple there. That's pretty significant. Okay, but what I will add after looking over these numbers, after doing kind of a time series analysis and trying to see if there's a trend, etc. If you go to the FBI, for example, what they do is they do something called uniform crime reporting, and they'll basically take all the departments and standardize the numbers, and then try to publish that as sort of a national statistic, and then you can kind of compare and contrast across regions. Now, I'm not challenging their authority on this, because I try to do it myself, and it's not easy when you're trying to cross-compile, because all these police departments and sheriff departments do their accounting differently. They have different computer systems. They have different methodologies. They have different rules for recording things or arresting things. So a lot of this stuff isn't even recorded. Some of it's not recorded right, or if it's recorded in a different manner. So there's nothing really uniform about this, and they're making an attempt to do it. And then over time, they may even change the system. So even doing year-to-year comparisons is difficult. So my kind of conclusion was it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on. You can kind of get a rough idea, hopefully, from the numbers. But I would say that if a guy lives somewhere and then lives somewhere else, I'd say that's ultimately the best you can do about knowing what the hell the situation is. But James, maybe you can kind of clarify. What do you think the crime situation is like? How does it compare to the other places you've been to?
Well, let's just look at that item you were talking about, the property crimes. A lot of those aren't property crimes. In Baltimore City and Baltimore County, home invasions are usually listed as destruction of property or burglary. If they get in, it's a burglary. If they don't get in, it's destruction of property. A friend of mine rescued some old woman. This goon was kicking down her door in the middle of the day, trying to get to her. And the cop that came out, and he recorded it as destruction of property. That's what he put in his report. That was just 1.5 miles from where I sit right now. As far as other places that I've gone to, once a month, sometimes once a week, depending on my writing schedule, I visit my mother, my sister, and my aunt. They all live together out in Harford County, which is suburban America. But you've had to erect this structure that you find all across the country 30 miles outside of Baltimore. And it's just two different planets. Now, visiting Utah, I spent 2 weeks with Ishmael out in Utah. I actually developed the shakes on a couple of occasions. One of the things that just consistently freaked me out was nobody locked their doors. I mean, to the house, to their car, and it was really bothering me. And I didn't realize it was adding up to a high stress level for me, that it was just driving me crazy. I never know who's going to be in a building because the door's unlocked. Wow. I have a different, it's
essentially you feel more comfortable in Baltimore than you did in Utah.
Well, yeah, because the spaces were wider, and nobody was cagey, nobody was on their guard, nobody was locking anything up. So in parts it felt to me like it couldn't be real. I felt like I was on a cloud somewhere, and then the cloud was just going to evaporate. It was really strange. The first time out on a mountain alone with him, I actually was shaking. I was having like some kind of habitat anxiety. And I'm walking around in this beautiful field. I was eating these grouse berries, and he pulls up a 2-pound porcini mushroom that would, sell for $9 pound dry weight in the supermarket. We eat it for lunch. It was so different that it actually cause me anxiety. Now, when I go out to my mother's in Harford County, I relax. You know, I feel, when I'm out there, I feel like a lion laying down in a playpen. Out in the suburbs, that's just really relaxing. But in the rural area, that freaked me out. And when I was a kid and I lived in Pennsylvania, I spent as much time in the woods as I could. But that was a closed environment. The woods are more like a city than these desert mountains.
It's interesting the way that, like, even in very violent areas, there's still kind of like an internal logic to the system. And there's still like an internal logic to each individual encounter. Like, the couple of times that I've been like in a situation where like I'm about to be mugged, there's like a definite kind of like sizing up moments where they try to figure out like what's going on here, like this group of guys, are they together, like where are their hands, and they decide like, okay, am I going to try to like establish dominance or not? And like you actually see the same thing with cops. It's really funny when you see like this play out with somebody who doesn't really know like what they're supposed to do, and they fuck it up, and that's when things actually get dangerous. But when you're kind of pair dropped into a different environment where you don't know, like, oh yeah, I'm being mugged, like it's time to like hand over my wallet, or oh yeah, like the cops are shaking me down, I need to like, you know, act like I'm at the zoo or whatever. You know, the violence seems to arise, like it seems to like concretize when somebody doesn't really know what's going on. I'm wondering if you've like kind of seen that dynamic play out, or if you could kind of speak to that a little bit.
Oh yeah, that's like blood in the water. You know, I had the experience with when Ishmael would come down to take me to the airport in Salt Lake City or pick me up. This guy was freaking out because he's a real mountain man. This is a guy that lives on top of a mountain. And Salt Lake City, I think, from the look of it, I was totally relaxed. I would have gone to sleep on the sidewalk there. It seemed like one of the most bucolic cities I've ever seen. But to him, it was this alien environment that got him agitated. And aggressors look for agitated people. Yeah, that'll get it. Now, he asked me, he said, would I be immediately victimized if I went into Baltimore? And my answer to him was, I thought no, because he's a big guy. People would think he was insane because this real big guy would be agitated. And a real big agitated person, that's not somebody that predators go after. Predators go after somebody that either seems to be trying to fit in and they're agitated because it comes off as insecurity, or somebody that's physically doable and they're agitated. So it kind of depends on what your presence is. For instance, you don't want to go anywhere near an agitated West African soldier who's had no training, okay, and he's got his AK-47. You don't want to be near that guy. So it kind of depends on who you are, but displaying any type of agitation, if you're not an imposing specimen, is going to attract trouble.
What about just looking crazy? Like, you know, you'd start like shaking. You look like you have allergies or something. Does that turn anybody off?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I had one time I tried shaving my own head and it didn't work. Okay. And then I go to my girl's house.
Like a mental patient.
Yeah. I look like they tried to electrocute me and it didn't work. And nobody got anywhere near me. Yesterday, Megan's granddaughter was dressing me up. She was putting butterflies on me and bunny ears on me and everything. And this was in the middle of me telling Megan about these 4 thugs trying to bank me on Middle River Bridge. And she just said, you know, if you would just let my granddaughter dress you up, those guys would never bother you. You know,
she probably has a point.
You can do that, and that's what's behind a lot of the piercings and the tattooings and a lot of this effective wardrobe that young people that live in cities use. But I'm not an actor, so it's not something that I've ever tried. You've got to be somebody with some acting ability. I know some people have done really good jobs acting their way through situations, but you've got to have that skill.
Walk us through kind of a typical like ambush area. I mean, so we can avoid it hopefully, but like, what are the areas where these guys typically hang out? I mean, is it outside of bars? Is it like just some dark alleyway? Like, what areas should people be careful when they're going through?
The place where most people are made is leaving any type of retail establishment or an eatery, especially if there's a place where there's an ATM there. If you guys all sound like bright guys, so you probably live in pretty decent places. The biggest thing you'd have to worry about is, one, if you're out with your woman, anytime you're with a woman, all your risks go up because she's going to compromise you in a lot of ways that you might not even understand, but they understand. One, your desire to protect her is compromising to begin with, but then she's going to distract you. So the worst situation that most guys listening to this are probably going to be in, they're out with their woman, they stop and they do some shopping, they maybe go to the ATM and pick up some cash, go to the liquor store, and they head home, and you get made at that hub. That's the watering hole. Okay, now if you're living in a decent area, the watering hole is not where you get hit like it is out there on the Serengeti, but it's where you're going to get made, and then they'll just follow you home. And anytime you see an automobile that has more than 2 men in it, then they're hunting. They're either hunting women because they're like drunk Romanians in town for a good time, or they're hunting anybody. They're hunting men. So the big thing is actually where you leave a trace, where you leave a track, because you're a hunted animal. The problem is, for the hunters, there's really not that many of them. 300 and some million people in this country. There's a high density of prey. So the luck of the wildebeest saves us most of the time. So you want to be really careful about going anywhere near a place where you would be spending or gathering cash or goods, and then being watchful when you leave there and then when you get home. Getting home is more common. You're more likely to get hit getting home than when you're leaving your dwelling.
Well, I read a sort of section in one of your books that talked about things to do when you're in a situation like this, and one of the things that stuck out to me is actually when you're in the store itself. That's part of the fishnet they set up, because they want to filter out guys who aren't paying attention, that don't have situational awareness. And one of the things that you mentioned that you do when you bring in somebody like a woman to a liquor store is you let her shop and you actually watch everything that's going on around so that they see there's a guy who's paying attention. I thought that was good advice.
Pacing makes it better. If you pace, if you prowl, it's all better. What you don't want to be, first of all, avoid putting your hands in your pockets as a matter of course. You want to have something in one of your pockets that you can put your hand on and pull it out and hit somebody with it, even if it's just a pen or a little stone that you picked up or anything, your keys. Having something in your pockets that you can pull out is always a good thing, because they don't know what's in your pocket. But you don't want to be somebody that stands around with your hands in your pockets. You want to be somebody that has your hands around your hips. And when you're being alert, you don't want to be nervous. So it's easier not to look nervous when you're moving. So if you're going to be looking around, instead of just standing in one place, move around a little bit. And it'll also develop less tension in your neck. If you're going to get knocked out by getting hit, it's more than likely going to be a sneak hit, and it's going to be any time when your neck is stressed. So if you're kind of nervous that you're being surrounded by guys, or you don't know if these are good people passing you, you don't want to be standing there with your hands in your pockets and craning your neck around, because if you get hit when you're doing that, then it could just be lights out right there, and then they're jumping up and down on top of you. So moving around as you're swiveling your head's a good idea for a lot of reasons.
Does this mostly happen at night, or is this something that's anytime?
That's changing. It's gotten to the point in Baltimore where we've got 3 levels. Maybe not 3 levels. It might be more. Morning now we had a shooting nearby me at 6:30 in the morning. Okay, so traditionally,
but was it still over from partying from the night before, or what's going on there? Is that a hit? They planning?
It was two guys got in an argument and then a fight between two parked cars on a side street, and then they both pulled out guns and started shooting at each other. And so I don't know what it was about. But traditionally, even in Baltimore, up until the riots, up until 2015, that's a huge watermark for us. 6 o'clock in the morning till noon, every place was pretty safe. If I wanted to go into a bad neighborhood where a guy got shot or stabbed to take photos for my early violence books, I would go in at 6 o'clock in the morning. There might be a couple of lookouts there looking for tactical squads coming in to break into stash houses, but nobody's out there hitting anybody at that time in the morning. It started to change. We're having murders and killings and everything in the morning, starting at 2 in the afternoon until 6 in the evening. And what we've got here in Baltimore now, you've actually got a daylight pack hunting, where you have groups of youths between 2 and 15 hunting for easy targets. One of the things they're doing is just stopping cars. 5 of them come right out in the middle of a street, and they won't let you pass. You got to run them over. So that kind of stuff goes on until dark. And then at dark, then you start getting groups of 2 and 3 guys that are doing more targeted hunting, and it's very likely that one of them has a firearm. And their peak times for striking are 7, and then from 7 to 8, and then from 9 to 10. 8 and 9 is kind of like a rest period. They'll move to a different location. And then when the bars start to clear out between midnight and 3, you'll have the younger guys will come out again. You'll have the adults hunting men. You'll have your 18 to 30-year-old guys out there in small teams hunting men in the early dark hours. But then when it comes time for drunks to come out of bars, now the kids are back out on the street. Now you're dealing with teenagers again. And that's pretty dangerous because this is a person with a high energy level. And the type of people they're really feral. These are kids who on a school night in the winter, their mother makes them go out to earn money so that they can eat, because all her food stamp money is going to steaks and seafood for her various paramours.
You described that extremely well on another podcast, where basically what they'll do is they won't feed the kids the best food, but what they'll do is they'll take that money and buy the steak so they can get the next boyfriend to get them the next kid to get the next welfare check.
Right, and he's also, for the immediate gain, he's also bringing the liquor and the weed. He's taking a risk. He's going to that liquor store where the owners are behind bulletproof glass, and he's getting the weed and he's bringing it to her. So everybody takes the risk but mama. The boys are out there taking risks, and the guy that's going to get in her, unsavory declivity are taking the risk also.
It's interesting. I've had a few run-ins when I was younger in school with some black quote-unquote classmates. I don't remember exactly what they were doing in class, but on the playground, they made their presence known. And I asked one for my kickball ball back once, and he hit me in the eye. And basically, it was his mother that was just the most combative. My son ain't done nothing wrong. No way, no how. And she just would not. She wouldn't see any problem with him doing that. And so there's really no discouragement. And of course, there's no father around. And so
she was punching him since he was 2, probably.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, and they're really tough. And then the few times that you do see the dad around, he actually is kind of a break on this shit. I've noticed. I don't know if that's correct, but I've seen a couple examples of that.
I see it constantly. The black women in our urban society here in Baltimore, there's no brakes on them. They're the queens of the world. Everything revolves around them. They actually teach their sons to argue with the cops. And then they hit the lottery when this kid gets killed. The men I ran a supermarket for 4 years. I've coached various boxing teams. The number of my fighters and clerks that have been taken out of circulation by Baltimore City cops and black women is beyond counting. I've lost entire night crews because I got decent, hardworking black guys trying to get to my store on foot and on the bus, and I got cops just like randomly snapping them up. And they're also getting robbed by other black dudes. And if that's not happening, their old lady might pick a fight for them just so that she could call the cops on them and have the cops take him away. And then she can get another man in there that'll act as a block for him to come back. So these guys have to be very cagey. If they're not in prison or if they're not homeless, then this guy, he's negotiating with the cops, he's negotiating with a white boss, or he's working for a black boss that's treating him horribly, and he's got to deal with this savage wench. So you can actually get a lot of negotiating done if you earn their respect. As far as black guys go, I find it very easy to deal with black men.
Yeah, this is something the Hoteps talk about constantly. Is like they blend in the kind of the quasi manosphere talk about, like, the harmful effects of black matriarchy, and how fellas, we got to get these black women under control.
It's horrible, and to me, it's not a matriarchy; it's a maimed patriarchy, because all they've done is they replaced the man with the government. Well,
that's how
this woman's really not a matriarch in any queenly sense.
I've seen you describe Baltimore as sort of a weird quasi matriarchy, with the kind of the government serving as the dad, but the black women sort of run a lot of the families and a lot of the city as well. Would you agree with that?
Yes. The saddest thing I've ever seen was at a Carrabba's Italian steakhouse. It was for my mother's birthday. I'm there with my whole family. We've got a balanced family. Next to us is this 12-person extended table. And there's only one adult male there. There's 5 generations. There were 5 generations of women. There were a couple of black boys. There were the black girls. And then there was one beaten down man that was the brother of, I think, the grandmother. That was it. This was a family. We were having a family dinner, and they were having a family dinner, and that's what was there.
This is like the Thomas Sowell thing too. That, like, the government as daddy thing is like a canonical, like, black Republican, so to speak, talking point. But, like, that's something that everybody seems to be more or less okay with.
Well, I'm not okay with it, but I don't have a stake in it other than it's the factory that generates my enemies, and the kids that'll probably kill me come out of this whole mess.
Well, I've heard that black men have numerically an advantage in the dating market, and partly that's why they don't really stick around to be a father, because they have a lot of options. But essentially, there's so many of them in jail that the ratio of women to men is higher. And so they can go from girlfriend to girlfriend and not marry them or something. And it's interesting to hear you describe kind of the women's power dynamic in this, because they're essentially getting these quote-unquote alpha men to kind of get them pregnant. But there's got to be enough women out there that aren't getting that as well. Or maybe they are. I'm just not seeing how that works. But, where I live, there's an area where you can go, where you can see prostitutes. And there's 9 times out of 10, they're just black. They're black women. They don't seem to be having a whole lot of power in the sexual market. So maybe you can talk to that.
As far as the impregnating them, you've got teenage boys to broken down old men impregnating these girls. The important thing for the girl is that he's not sticking around. You know, we're made to think that it's the guy that's just leaving. The guys that just leave, they're the guys with high market value. Okay. You know, like the guy that's going to be the black James Bond, that kind of guy. Okay. The kind of guys that white women are going to be into as sex toys. For most of the black men that I've known, they've just been repeatedly put out of the dwelling that they were in, first by their mother, then by their sister, then by the woman that they knock up. She doesn't want to have, in most cases, the same father for each of her children. She wants them split up. You know, she's actually being paid off to keep these guys away, and she wants to have the say-so. You know, when you give somebody power, it's hard to take it away from them, and she wants to have the power. If you look at sexual currency, look at the rape stats. So 2013, I think it was like 14,000 black on white rapes to like 7 white on black rapes. You know, that's just, you know, even though I do believe that rape is primarily aggression, there's still a component of sexual attraction there. And that tells you something about it. For the most part, I think that the narratives that we normally see from the right and from the left, I think they don't put a clear picture on just how alienated and how damaged the black man is by this whole system. It's not like they all want this. They've adapted to it. Yeah.
Well, there was a report released by Family Research Council's Marriage and Religious Research Institute in 2015 that said that only 16% of 15 to 17-year-old teens in Baltimore have been raised in an intact married family.
Yeah, that sounds just right. I know there's a charter school that has zero parent households. Nobody in this entire charter school even has. It's in East Baltimore. Even has a parent at home, and half of them only have a single grandparent at home.
And I think like 72% of, on the national level, 72% of African Americans are born out of wedlock. Last I checked, that was the breakdown.
That was the latest numbers that I saw too. It was a libertarian economist that put out a book on the cracking up of America. I forget his name.
James, have you watched any of Mike Tyson's interviews?
I've seen a couple of interviews with him. I'm familiar with his career. I think I read just about every biography.
I actually got interested in him because I was watching some of his interviews after he became Mike Tyson. I was too young, basically, to know much about that when he was doing that. Only post, prison, I think I kind of was paying attention to him. But in the 80s, I mean, he was the fighter, and this is before Don King sunk his teeth into him, by the way. And what I learned in sort of looking at, because he kind of went through this transformation after he got out of jail. He was out of control. He was on the drugs and spending money. He went broke. He's married. He has children now. And he's really changed his kind of demeanor in how he presents himself and talks to people. And he's matured quite a bit, in my opinion. And you can look at some of his interviews with Graham Bessinger, for example. Or there's some clips where he's talking about his trainer, Custamato, and it's really touching because where Mike came from was he basically grew up without a dad, and the guy was like a pimp or something, and his mother was alcoholic, and you're just describing the typical life of a young black man, and he lived it. And when he met his trainer, he went up to upstate New York, and he just took him in, and he'd never been treated like that before, and he really bonded with this guy. And when he passed away, and in describing that, you could see this was like his father to him. He'd never experienced that before, and it changed him as a man, and he taught him a lot about character and honor and all that. And it's when he died that he kind of lost control because he didn't he didn't have any break on his misbehavior, and that's when he got into trouble. And there was even an interesting clip where Donald Trump was defending him because it's not clear as to how he got into trouble with this woman who accused him of beating her and raping her. And you can watch the clip with Donald Trump, but basically Trump had promoted Mike at one of his casinos in Atlantic City multiple times, and so he got to know him. And he said, I can't speak for the details because I wasn't there, and this is Donald Trump speaking, but what I will say is that woman is very suspicious because the morning that she claims that Mike raped her, she was going to a beauty pageant. And this is on film. She's all smiles, she's happy, there's no problem, and Mike had claimed that it was consensual as well. So Trump was defending him, and this is one thing I like about Trump. He's very loyal, and he saw kind of that there was something wrong here, and he had said that Mike had horrible legal representation, and he also went so far as to say that Mike had been taken advantage of all his life, and in particular with Don King and people like that. And so Mike is a great case in that you take a guy like that who's out of control. He was basically he was doing petty theft for one of these street gangs. He's breaking into houses and things like that. And you take a guy like that and you give him some structure and a masculine role model. You can really make something out of a guy. And I think one of the tragedies of America today is that we've really, not just in black communities, but in all communities, frankly, with perhaps some exceptions, is that we've taken the role of the father away and we've replaced it with this equalist and somewhat feminist parenting model, which includes the schools, which includes the corporations, which includes the media and everything else. So that was kind of a long introduction to masculinity, but that's kind of a big topic of yours, James. Maybe you could talk about that.
Yes. Oh, as far as Tyson goes, the best book I read on him was titled Blood Season. And I think he was set up. As far as the girl goes, it was very easy to set Mike up. His trainers played a joke on him one time. They said, Mike, you got to understand, when you got a guy that's a fighter of that magnitude, his handlers bring him women after the fight. Right. Ali used to have 10, 12 girls lined up outside of his door. Chuck Liddell, would have piles of women after his fights. Rocky Marciano did it, so it was a common thing. The guy's the king and he gets what the king gets. Well, one of their trainers was a slim dude with long blonde hair. The other three trainers told Mike, I said, hey, Mike, we got a girl for you in the other room. She came up here to see you. Well, the other trainers, and they're asleep. The skinny guy with the long blonde hair, Mike climbs right on him and mounts him, and he's pulling his clothes off and everything all at the same time. And they both had this moment where they both look at each other and realize that they're both dudes. That Mike's raping me, and Mike's like, oh, you're a dude. So he was taught sexuality in this manner when he's still a teenager, being rewarded like this. Gus D'Amato's setup that he had with his wife, it was basically a house for orphan boys where they went. Those guys went there and they lived there. And when he died, you had a contest between Robin Givens and the women around her, because he married this bitch, right, over control against his junior trainers. And they immediately got rid of the guy with the most character. The guy that could have been a daddy figure was Teddy Atlas. They got rid of him right away. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, so that the way he was handled was just horrific. And I think that Don King intentionally got him set up for that rape so he could fleece him of his money while he was in prison.
Don King is a piece of shit. He basically, he's actually, I think he was convicted or let off, or he had to go to trial for this, but he curb stomped a guy to death. That's on record. And
Ving Rhames plays him in an HBO movie. It was maybe 20 years ago this HBO movie was made. Ving Rhames did.
And Mike wised up to this guy. I mean, there's a video of him on YouTube calling Don King a piece of shit. I mean, he basically just says as much.
Good for him. Well, I've been thrilled about the turnaround that's come with Mike Tyson.
I have too. I'm really impressed by him. I mean, he's a very wise guy, you know, a wise man. If you listen to him talk, you know, he gets these punk reporters that try to like, oh, you know, Don or Mike, you were accused of rape. You know, how are you getting over that? And he'll call him out on it, and he gets angry because he knows what they're doing, and he's upset, but he's tough, and he's not willing to be pushed around because he's been used so much that he knows what's going on at this point. And I give a lot of respect to him for that, because a lot of people, they go on the media, you know, and they want to get, you know, promotion or something. Fuck it, dude. He just tells people, you know, you're a piece of shit reporter. Fuck you, you know. And I love that stuff, because most people are liars, you know, especially when they're trying to promote themselves. And I appreciate that honesty.
The guys that come to me for the boxing or the stick fighting coaching, it's either a guy that's an experienced fighter that wants to get into mixed martial arts, or wants to work on something very specific, or it's just a guy that didn't have a dad.
Yeah.
You know, I would say it's probably more of the latter. You know, I didn't have this. You know, there were the poor, and when I lived in Pennsylvania, there was a poor woman who didn't have a man, who had 2 kids, and they used to come up and hang out with me. I was a teenager, and they were like 10 or 11, and I guess I was like their big brother to them. Those were, growing up, those were the only boys that I knew that didn't have a father at home.
Well,
and
remember when Bill Cosby was kind of like the big like role model in the black community, and of course this was you know, raising suspicions about what happened, you know, in the past, and then why did this come about 20 plus years later? You know, very, very interesting conspiracy theory there. But it's like he wrote a book called Fatherhood, and it was about the importance of a father. And you know, the one he played on TV was a pretty good guy. The one he played in real life, you know, you can debate that. But what is going on with the black father today, and then in general about the fatherhood in America?
Oh, I think it's how you get anything done in this society. You bribe people. I think that black women have been bribed to live without the fathers of their children. I just think it's a payoff. It's a government payoff. And it's important, I think, if you're going to have this atomized society where you can play everybody against everybody else anytime you want to, and you're looking at it as a manager instead of a leader that's trying to cultivate something, then I think it's a good thing for the government. I think it's a good thing for the state. Eventually, I think men are going to be, if we continue to have the type of technological advances we've had, and it continues to go linearly up, which I don't think it's going to, but if it did, I think eventually you're going to see something like what Alice B. Sheldon wrote about, societies in the future where men, if they existed, would have some really specific role, maybe for entertainment. There's not very many women have taken down governments. So if you represent the government interests, you've got a hard on for men. You want to get rid of men, particularly aggressive men. And how many people out of Africa have taken down governments? Not that many of them. I think Englishmen have probably taken down more governments than people out of Africa have taken down in history. So,
well, in the 20th century, it's the Britain's student America has probably done that more than anybody.
So why do you want men, particularly white men? You don't want them if you're the system.
Well, and it also interferes with this deployment of kind of like a weaponized population flow of black population. Like the book "Slaughter of Cities" by blanking on the name.
E. Michael Jones.
Yes, E. Michael Jones. Like, I'm not sure if I completely buy into his hypothesis that like this was a plot by evil Protestants to destroy the Catholic white working class. But you can look at things like the Obama Section 8 policy, where they're explicitly targeting sort of middle class, mixed areas in purple states for resettling black population. And that only works if you can use government policy to dictate where those population flows go. And that only really works if you have a substantial contingent that's depending on the government for housing and food and everything else. So, I mean, if you allowed stable family formation, you lose a large amount of political leverage and you lose a lot of foot soldiers for the establishment.
Well, historically speaking, the main way in which black behavior was kept in line was violence.
Yeah, Jim Crow.
Well, that's how every group is kind of civilized over time. Like the English executed like 1% of their population per year for like a couple hundred years, and they, after that they were nice and peaceful.
But we're not seeing white riots in Baltimore.
They had over 100 capital crimes in England during the plantation era. Yeah. You could be hung for stealing a chicken.
Yeah, Nick, so or go ahead, Hank.
Well, I was wondering, like, Nick, so, I mean, yeah, like, historically you civilize populations with violence. Like, civilization is almost like violence held in abeyance. But, like, I mean, it definitely seems like at a certain point in time, we kind of decided to have a really schizophrenic attitude towards that, where obviously there's still like vast amounts of violence deployed. Like you have like basically like a police state in these areas. It's just that it's kind of a dramatically ineffective means of deploying violence. But I don't know that like the actual quantity of state violence is any less in modern Baltimore than in 1950 Selma or wherever you'd like to use as your exemplar.
That brings up a question I have for James.
Yes.
James, do you think that we are living in more or less violent times than our ancestors?
Well, to build on that, are you familiar with the work of Steven Pinker, and do you think it's credible or BS? Because he basically posits that we're seeing a broad decline in violence.
Well, if you're going by any official statistics, you can't even trust it. Especially now, the violent crimes not even being reported. Well, I think what we've done is we have areas where things are so much less violent than any historical norm that preceded the 1900s, and then you have other areas where it's ridiculously violent. The thing that drives me crazy is when people use the term Dodge City and the Wild West, as if we don't want to get back to that level of violence. And that comes from this study that the FBI did comparing murders in Miami during the cocaine wars in the early 1980s with Dodge City. And they came out with an equivalent number of killings per 100,000. But there were so few people in Dodge City, some years nobody died, and that one year they used for comparison, only one guy got killed, and it was a duel over a woman, where they're comparing machine gun battles in shopping malls in Miami to that. So the level of violence in colonial, it was really plantation America, not colonial America, but the level of violence was very high. It was a lot higher than anything we've been led to believe. And one of the reasons why blacks were brought in was because they were, as slaves, was because they were pre-broken. They were shipped in as people that were already broken initially on the plantations, born and bred to it in the West Indies. Then they went in the 1670s, they went straight to Africa for them. for the first time, there were a number of nearly successful revolutions by Irish, Scottish, and English slaves. Sometimes with the Indians on their side, sometimes with the Indians on the plantation owners' side. The first slave catchers were Indians. So the purpose for bringing blacks into the U.S. was initially that they cost 4 or 5 times as much. The advertisement was they were less assertive, they were less violent, you wouldn't have to be as cruel to keep them in line. That was the reason why they were really brought in. What I've seen in my lifetime is black people continually becoming more violent than they were when I was a child, and less good at it, because they're less likely to do physical jobs or to be involved in something like boxing or anything like that. So overall, I have no idea if humanity is more violent, but it seems to be you have certain pressure cooker locations where the government wants it to be really violent, and you've got other areas where it's like a feedlot where they don't want any violence there. So I kind of don't know how to answer that.
I feel I asked a somewhat incorrect question about quantity, because that's not really, I mean, your works, you describe them yourself as violence books. Mm-hmm. And Hank described a schizophrenic attitude, and I see that our podcast, we deal with 20th century history, and 20th century is full of violence and mass slaughter, from the nuking of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, firebombing of Dresden, to the starvation and famines in Russia, and China. And we have a pretty big death toll here. But at the same time, I think the way in which we think about violence, especially in the so-called civilized world, we have a certain expectation that the violence is removed from us, that it's always somewhere else. So I guess really the question is how do we think about violence that is different from our ancestors? How have we become less able to think about it and address it?
Oh, it's this idea that we're civilized. Now, I'm not an advocate of civilization. So I think it's denaturing, and eventually it brings its own plague, this feral barbarism, which is going to be worse. You're much better dealing with some Iroquois warrior, okay, that has a set of rules that he lives by and is 100 times more combat effective than your average hood rat, than you are dealing with a pack of hood rats who are in this de-evolutionary spiral behavior. So I would prefer to deal with barbarians than I would to deal with a bunch of sissy civilized people who on the side cultivate these little feral savages that they have no code of behavior. So they're more difficult to deal with. You actually can't negotiate with them. It's like being an animal handler. When I go out at night, I'm an animal handler. I had to deal with 4 men that were less than half my age. I'm 54. These guys were all around 20. Heavyweight, middleweight, welterweight, and a tall lightweight. And I had to deal with all these guys. And one of them had a knife. And I had to figure out a way not to get in combat with them, because this was last Monday night, because there's no way I win. If I win, I lose. I go to prison, and probably all my stuff gets taken down. Amazon bars my name, whatever. And I dealt with them like I would deal with animals. And it worked. It ended up being just basic body language and one look at the one guy at the one time, and that's it, and the whole thing crumbled. I followed my protocols all the way through, and it didn't even bother me. And then a block down the road, I got the shakes. I started having this anxiety attack after it happened. But as it happened, I was perfectly calm, because it's something I deal with all the time. But I think it's starting to wear on me, my age and everything.
Well, to read from your book, War Drums, my crime in the eyes of both these mortal enemies, black men and the police, is the same: walking while working class and white in a majority black American city. I plead guilty. You wrote that after you saw the Freddie Gray riots firsthand. Maybe you can tell us about that experience and why you think that happened. And in particular, I'd like you to comment on the three factors here, the three players, if you will. You've got the black community, you've got the white community, and you've got the system.
Okay. I really think the system and the criminal elements of the black community work together to form those riots. I mean, we actually had public collusion where the mayor is telling the cops to let them go out and pillage. The
space to destroy.
Yeah, it was just that was great. Well, that was an audition. You had as soon as Freddie Gray died, you had the Justice Department say that they were going to be investigating the Baltimore City Police. That gets the police to hunker down and be less active. Then these three gangs piled on top of that, and they made a social media threat that they were going to start shooting cops. And this had the predictable effect of cutting police presence in half by the order that the chief of police gave that nobody patrols alone. Everybody goes out together. So that cuts your intelligence net in half. You're less aggressive. Your intelligence net basically gets cut in half. And then the students from the Frederick Douglass High School, I was on the phone with a lady who was one of the first people to find out about this. This was an audition to join these gangs. 300 of these kids went out there and actually defeated the Baltimore City Police Department in an open battle. Now, while this whole circus was going on, there was another riot before that happened around the stadium where there were actually some white dudes out there, middle-aged fans of the Baltimore Orioles, that were beating the piss out of these hood rats, and their women got in the middle of it. and then you got this white lady out there, oh no, you can't fight. And now her husband's getting attacked by three guys because they know they got to help her in the form of his dumb bitch wife. So there were a few different things that went on as far as the riots. The most important thing that went on was the city and countywide purge, because the entire Baltimore County Police Department went to Towson. It's a bottleneck along this one road that takes you out into the really fertile suburban Hunt Valley area. And that's their tax base. They weren't going to allow that to get hit. The rest of the county was left wide open. And I traveled through that. I have a friend that's an orthopedic surgeon who operated on a bunch of people that were lone white guys that were being attacked by mobs of black guys. Now, the 37 pharmacies were looted. That fentanyl is still out there. Just about every liquor store was hit. The police managed to control two very small perimeters with the help of out-of-town police and military contractors, just enough to protect the administration, and the media huddled within that. There was no medical service. We had people die because the EMTs couldn't go out without cops, and the cops were not allowed to go out. The white folks, for the most part, just stayed inside. So, ironically, there wasn't enough white meat to satiate the thirst for it. So you actually had a lot of black people that got attacked at random by people that were out looking for white people to hunt. And all they could find was some kid coming home from his dishwashing job. And he's a black kid, but oh well, somebody's got to buy it. When they go out for blood, they're going to get blood. And that has continued. That purge is ongoing. It's no longer a race purge. You're still far more likely to be attacked if you're spotted and you're white. But so few white people allow themselves to be out there on foot anymore that it's really turned into this thing where, you know, the hardworking black dude is just getting mob attacked by these black criminals. And that's a real short version of how it went from the riots to just this hunt. It's just this ongoing hunt.
There's so much to go from here, but the police, you know, you can watch a lot of videos on YouTube and be careful with, you know, the source and try to be comprehensive and trying to get a holistic view of the whole thing, because, you know, everybody's got an agenda and they put something up and they edit it there's going to be omission, and all that. And there's just a series of videos that I had time to take a look at, and one of them is a black guy getting pulled over by the police, and they're putting their hands in this car, and it's like, hey, you got no right to do that, et cetera, et cetera. But you can tell the police are actually somewhat afraid to arrest him because there's a lot of pressure on them. There's another video I watched where there was a shootout, and it was actually a white guy who had robbed somebody, and he got on a bus. And somebody called the police and saw that he got on a bus, and they stopped the bus. And the white guy gets all the people off the bus, but he's got 2 40s in his pocket.
I saw that video.
Yeah, and
I used to work right there where that happened.
Yeah, and the cops kill him after unloading all their shotguns into the front of the bus, and then shooting all their pistols at him. Not very good shots, and there aren't a lot of rifles, which is what I noticed. Also, because they could have cleaned him out pretty quickly if they had one, but they ended up. One of the officers got shot. A woman. I don't know what she's doing there, but this is America, so everybody's got to have a chance to get injured on the job doing something they're not supposed to be there for. And then you've got a civilian that got shot. I don't know if it was the white guy who did it or one of the cops, but it was full court press, and it took the entire squadron of these cars to take this one dude out. And there's just so many things to ask you about here. Like, one, the body camera footage that's released is of this woman cop or guy, I couldn't really tell. It's just a really soft facial features. And they're doing the typical cop thing, yelling and screaming, put the gun down, and they're just shooting randomly, and they got pistols, so you can't really shoot anything at a distance with that. But they're behind the engine blocks of the cars, and so they're trying to protect themselves and just get off a few pot shots, basically, and to get the guy to surrender, I guess. But it takes forever to get him down. And the other thing I noticed is that the white guy is not really taking anybody hostage. He gets everybody off the bus. Okay, so that's interesting. So he's like, I don't know what his motivation is. He basically just wants to get away, I guess. But the camera was pointed at the hands of the officer, not necessarily of whom they're potentially shooting at. And I thought that was interesting because it's like they're most concerned with the usage of force, not necessarily what threat is coming at them. It's more like this is the sort of legal record of when the application of firearms is used. And I've heard you say that the cops basically have to claim that they feared for their life in order to use that weapon. And they're taught that because legally they're not allowed to use their weapon. I think the FBI has the same principle. It's like if you or you fear another agent is being threatened, then you're allowed to use lethal force in response. And this guy was good. This guy was armed and he was shooting. And so I don't take that away from them. But there's this body camera thing is a new phenomenon, and it's interesting to me if they're releasing all the footage, because there was another incident where the news got a hold of this story, and they're doing the typical news media thing where they basically they give you the conclusion, then they kind of give you a half-baked series of proof points that don't really prove anything. They just kind of like support the narrative. But they were basically saying that there was a guy who was unlawfully framed. I mean, he was pulled over and the body cameras were rolling. Then they turned them off, and then after they turned them back on, they got the guy saying, "Oh, I found some drugs in this guy's car." And so the guy in his defense said, "Hey, man, you planted those." Well, there's no footage of it, so who knows who's telling the truth. But it's interesting, they use those cameras, in various times, and I don't know if that solved anything. I mean, there's just so many things that you can maybe comment on here about, like how the police have reformed. Have they reformed? What's the situation there? Are they even helping anybody?
Well, James, you did some interviews with the cops for your book, When You're Food.
Yes.
And you wrote here that I this is quoting from you. I did manage some law enforcement interviews. Law enforcement situations share some predatory aspects, but generally fall outside of this study. Much of the following material is heavily edited to protect the cops and, well, the author from the cops.
Yeah,
you,
well, yeah, Big Mike put his hands on me and told me what was going in and what wasn't. That's one guy I used to talk to. Yeah, he was actually for a while the bodyguard of the chief of police. Big Italian dude. As far as the cops with the bus thing, the good video of that was taken by this black kid that was on the bus. And he's running around filming this, and he was hilarious. And this cop tries to get him to go into this house. And he says, I'm not going to go into that house. That's not my house. But it shows that there's one police officer that was on the flank of the crazy white dude from Pennsylvania, okay, that had tried to rob somebody next to this grocery store I used to work in. That cop was more worried about control of the people in the area than he wasn't taking down this guy that had a couple of guns on him. Mm-hmm. And I think for a while the guy was using the bus. He was reloading behind a bus driver who was this big fat black woman who was laying down, and this guy was hunkering down behind her like he was a shield or something. But one of the cops was out there on the wings, not thinking really tactically. He was thinking crowd control while this gunfight was going on. So they naturally don't make very good combatants in a firefight or something. The best body camera footage out of Baltimore, there was one that was a real plant where they showed them planting the whole thing on the body camera.
Jeez.
There's another one where there's a chase. This cop, big burly cop with these tattoos, heavy metal tattoos on his forearms, is chasing this guy that's got a gun. And this kid turns around and he's traversing the gun. No, so traverse is the wrong word. He's bringing it up as he's still running to point at the cop, and the cop hits him right before the kid levels the gun. And the complaint by our local newspaper people was that the cop had no right to shoot him because the guy hadn't pointed his gun at him yet, because the gun was still pointed at the pavement, but it was on the way up. The guy had every intention of shooting the cop. So that's how hairy it is for the cops legally. Right. Right there. As far as interviewing police, I've interviewed more police since I wrote When Your Food. I originally did those interviews in the late 90s and wrote that in 2000, and then blew the dust off of it and finished it in 2011. I rewrote it because Palahniuk had initially not accepted it. I've gotten more police interviews since then, and have tried to been. Generally, when I was writing When Your Food, I was looking at things from a mechanical perspective. And the cops just typed as criminals because this is what they do. They outnumber, they prey. They're better armed than they prey, and they attack the prey. So when a cop's arresting somebody, that behavior is a lot more in line with people coming after you to rob you in the civilian setting. So that's kind of what that one statement was getting at that I had there. And the most of the police that I have tried to speak to before and since then, they decline to talk to me at all. As soon as they find out I'm a writer, they head for the hills.
Well, they probably get in trouble from their
I had
captain.
One guy melted down. He's an ex-cop, and I figured out he was an ex-cop. And he's a regular customer at the supermarket I work at, real big, alpha male type of guy, deep voice. I said, "Excuse me, sir. You used to be a police officer, didn't you?" And this guy turned ghostly white. And he said, "Did you used to ride? Did you used to ride?" He's like, "I have nothing against bikers. I had a biker save my life one time." And he was freaking out. He said, whatever went under the bridge, it's under the bridge. If something happened in the past, I apologize. This guy immediately thought that I was a former criminal looking to come back on him.
Right.
Yeah, so it's really dicey trying to get law enforcement interviews. I recently coached a guy that was a former captain for the Baltimore County Police Department. And I got a lot of information out of him, and he was very helpful, but he trusted me because we had already punched each other. So that's a whole different thing. He was a good guy, and he was a good cop. He was the kind of guy that thought danger was fun. Right now, if he was on a force now, he would be a problem cop. His supervisors wouldn't be able to stand him because he's too ready for action. So we're in the middle of this sorting thing where the police establishments are trying to sort out aggressive types
Well, this is maybe a parallel to kind of the Serpico story. This is a true story, I believe, but the movie was portrayed by Al Pacino in the 70s about the New York City Police Department and his attempt to be a real cop, and his department essentially was all in the take, and they singled the guy out because he was basically putting a damper on their corruption and their ability to make money on the side. And I don't know if it's as explicitly corrupt where they're taking drug money. I'm sure some of that goes on. But today, in my own experience, and I described this to you when we were talking earlier, but it's basically, I describe it as kind of a low-level, apathetic corruption where people essentially look the other way to keep their job. They won't necessarily actively engage in a criminal act, but they won't report it either. How do you characterize today's society in terms of corruption, and in particular the police?
What I've noticed, and when I say 1/3, this is just a ballpark view based on my experience. I've noticed that about the same number of cops are corrupt as black people are criminals. Okay, I mean, it's about 1/3. Any way I cut it, any way I look at it, it seems about 1/3 of the cops I run into have tried to bully and harass me. And about 1/3 of the black people that I run into either try to rob me, terrorize me, hurt me, threaten me. I don't see any difference in the behavior between the cops and the blacks in this city. But what I'd like to point out, if you're in a situation, let's say you're a member of the black community or you're a cop. If you're in a situation where 1/3 of your number are actually, high commitment criminal types, who do you go to? Who do you talk to? If you see somebody do something wrong, if you say, so-and-so is stealing from the evidence room or whatever, by the time you've talked to 2 people, you've talked to one of their accomplices. Right. And you might speak to that person the first time you open your mouth. That might be, 3 out of 9, and you're not one of them. So that ups it even higher. If your odds of just opening your mouth to somebody that's involved is just too high. And then you've got the people that are going to be sympathetic to the crime also. So I think we're kind of at that perfect level of societal corruption, really. There was an armored car that was going from the Harvest Fair supermarket back to their headquarters, and the dodo forgot to lock the back door. It's going down Frankfurt Avenue in front of Mel's Towing. There's 2 guys in there. They're both armed. They're in the front. They look in the rearview mirror, and they see their money pouch has tumbled out of the back of this. It's got change in it, and it's got the bricks of $10,000. It's the $20 bills all get bundled in the bricks of $10,000. Okay, the bricks of 10 grand are flying all over the place. Change is flying all over the place. Checks, whatever, and you have people coming out of businesses and houses and just converging on this money in the middle of the street. I think it was Abacus. The Abacus drivers get out and they look back there, and there's no way they're going to recover that money. No. They were completely intimidated, and I found out about this because I was shopping in the supermarket that the money had just been brought away from, and the customers, it's at the end of the month, within a half hour, they're in the supermarket spending that money.
We call that a high time preference around here.
Okay, so we're there, and we're there with the police. The police are really not any different than the criminal population as far as their level of involvement in this kind of stuff. My wife recently reminded me of a situation where her and I were speaking together about our deteriorating marriage. This was a couple years before she kicked me out, and she said, "Do you remember that time that we were at Burdick Park and the 2 cops made us leave?" And I had just it went down the memory hole. And she reminded me about it. We started talking to me about it. And it's yeah, I mean, we were the only people in the park, middle of the day. married couple with wedding rings, holding hands, sitting on a park bench, discussing our relationship. And we had 2 cops come to the park and made us leave. And they made no bones about it. And she said that she kept her mouth shut because she was afraid they were going to beat me up. And there was a time when she was with me when I was sparring with a guy at an outdoor facility, and 4 cops came up, and she actually said something smart about maybe one of them should try boxing with me or something, which I couldn't believe she said. So this same chick that said that to Baltimore County cops, when these city cops came up, she didn't open her mouth. So she had been around, so she obviously could tell from their body language that they were looking to possibly do me some harm. And didn't want to know who we were, didn't ask for ID or anything. I don't know if they were doing a drug deal in that park, if they were going to be banging a hooker in that park, banging each other. I don't know. But we had to go. So,
James,
I just
listening
kind of go by 1/3. I just go by 1/3 rule.
I hear you.
1/3 of people
listening
are predators.
To your stories and just kind of comparing them to my own experiences. You have more life experience than I do, but it's basically brought me to the tentative conclusion, and I'd like to hear what you think about it, is that the system is really not your friend. I mean, everybody here is going to probably see that, but what do you do is the harder question, and it doesn't give you a lot of options. It's basically like you're either with it or against it, and I've sort of settled on a third way in that I'm trying to drop out of it because and this gets into our next show. I'll give a little teaser. We're going to be talking about Ted Kaczynski, but if you actually read his manifesto, he basically says the whole system, and this guy's a genius. I mean, he had a genius IQ. He taught math at, I don't know, like 20 years old at a pretty good university, and basically he concluded that, and here's a guy you would think would be, pretty up on technology. He concluded that technology is killing us, and civilization is actually killing us. And he went to live in the woods, basically, and then he got pissed off, and somebody built a road in his little part of the forest that he had found, and he just couldn't get away. But essentially, the more you participate in this corrupt system, and I'll expand your 1/3 because I think anybody who's participating in something that they're conscious of this act of corruption is corrupt in a way. It's sort of a passive compliance and complicity in a crime. And I heard from a cop who said, he's talking about the similar issues with, bullying, civilians and just, collecting people, they're like fishing, for their quota, and they'll get tickets, to fund the department. And not so much about fighting crime, it's about keeping the budget up and getting your numbers up and et cetera. And he said the only way you fight it is you turn in your badge. And I'll extend that to anybody who's in a corporation or an organization that is doing wrong, that if you see it and you can't get anywhere by speaking up, and you don't take yourself out of the equation, you're part of the problem. And this is easier said than done. Okay, I realize this, but I don't know how we're going to fix the system, because the system is not going to listen to us. It'll placate us with the quote-unquote democracy that we all supposedly have rights in, but we don't, really. If you become an enemy of the system and you're even following the law, just take a look at what happened with the Clinton machine recently with the election and all the scandals that came out with them, and the Obama administration or even the Bush administration. The entire establishment essentially plays by a different rule book. If you're in power, the justice system doesn't apply to you. And so as a little guy, which I'd include everybody in this conversation in that category, there's not much you can do to take it on head on. And I think really the easiest way to do it is almost live like you do. Just pay minimal taxes, don't contribute to their corrupt system, and you do more of that and they're going to start worrying, because then the money starts drying up, and then they got nothing to use to bribe you. So I'm wondering what you think we do. How do we get out of this situation as a civilization, if you even want to use that term, as a society? Let's use that word.
You don't want to be a beaver. One thing I learned when I was out west with Ishmael, he's everywhere he goes, he knows the name of every mountain, what animal eats that plant, etc. Everything out there that eats meat eats beaver. If you want the best bait meat you can get to get any kind of animal, from a coyote to a polar bear or a grizzly bear, to come into your trap, is beaver. Now, if you look at the wild, the beaver does more work than all the other animals put together. The thing transforms the landscape. Right. Sometimes they have to go in and kill them because they turn a stream into a lake. So you don't really I was raised to believe that I should be productive.
Right.
And I believe that. You guys are already figuring stuff out when I just had my head to the grindstone, was trying to make as much money as I could. So I'm glad to see that. So something's happening to wake people up. But you don't want to be productive. You end up like the beaver, because then all the parasites are going to come hit you up.
That's right.
And society is just grown out of this old conquest matrix, where the guys that herded the animals on the steppe came in and conquered the guys that tilled the earth and turned them into slaves and took their women for themselves. So I think that's about the only thing that we can do, what you're talking about. And it makes things clear for you. You can see a lot more when you're not in the struggle to advance your earnings. You can start to see a lot of things. I actually successfully managed a supermarket for 4 years. I actually saved this thing. It was going out of business. I was the lowest guy on a night crew in a chain store. Okay, that was the chain that had like 48 different stores. I was just a clerk. I went from being private to 3-star general in one stroke. But I had seen so much stuff from the bottom when I wasn't trying to climb the ladder, that I actually could see all the friction points that the management had to deal with. And I used to help my managers through things, because I would honestly talk to them about what was going on instead of trying to resist them. So when I became a manager, I just said, well, I can be my own advisor. I know all the points of resistance that I'm going to encounter in the workforce. And you can just see more of it if you get more people to go to the bottom. I have 74,000 words of interview already done with this fellow named Big Ron, who's just remodeled houses and worked as a carpenter on other types of job sites his whole life. And just from doing that, he knows more about how society works than all of the college graduates in my family and all of these guys that have master's degrees that I play tabletop war games with. And he says, look, it's just about keeping the money moving. When you pay that house off, they got to move your ass so they can keep the money moving, because he's involved in it. He builds the house, and then after it gets turned into a ghetto, he comes in and remodels the house. And he can tell you about how quick a stove lasts in a welfare house compared to a regular house, and blah, blah, blah. But you can learn a lot. Like, as Melville said, being the oyster, at the bottom of the sea, you look up, you get a pretty good panorama. You can't totally figure things out because you really can't see the sun, but, you get a good perspective from the bottom. So I recommend it.
So, James, after the Freddie Gray riots, the Small Business Administration found that there was about $9 million in estimated damage, with 30 businesses and one home sustaining major damage, and then 254 businesses and one home experienced minor damage. So the math breaks down to 8,927,000 to businesses and about 60,000 to homes. Does that kind of sound right, or does that sound like they're lowballing it?
I think it was worse than that, not by a lot though. Okay. I actually think the people thought he was hyperbolic, but I think the governor, I don't know where he got his information from. Maybe he talked to a fire department person, but he had it at over 150 fires. And I do know of one young lady who, her and her child, they survived, but they were burned out of their apartment. You see, a lot of these businesses have apartments attached to them. or apartments over top. You might have a liquor store and you've got 2 apartments over top of it because everything's built into these old row homes. Mm-hmm. So one business getting hit, you might have also made 2 families homeless. So it kind of depends on how you dice it. But there was also no tally. The reason why I'm going to say it's higher is there was no tally of anything in Baltimore County. And Baltimore County was ravaged. And it's just been hush-hush. There was not a policeman on duty in eastern Baltimore County in any of its 4 precincts for a full week. At night. During the day, yes. At night, no.
And the city itself, or I guess the police department of Baltimore, accrued just over $7 million in costs for this trial. So they had to pay $4.5 million for overtime and $2.5 million for supplies, mainly riot gear, and then the state's attorney's office accounted for $450,000 over the course of this trial. Do you think that do you think that there are hidden costs that they're not going into? Do you think that they're cooking the accounting to try and downplay how expensive this was for the city?
I don't know, but I really couldn't tell you. But I do know that the mayor was actually banking on making a profit on it after she got federal funds. Yeah, she's an interesting character, the mayor. So she told people, was it her or was it the state attorney or someone told them that they had room, that they wanted them to give them room to go out and destroy? That was the mayor. Was the mayor. Yeah, I'll tell you what, that upset a lot of Baltimore people. And a lot of black people, too. So they got burned out of their homes. This goes into, I guess Adam was elaborating on earlier, that the system's not on your side, where the system is actively encouraging people to go out and cause crime and destroy. There's a big gentrification initiative in Baltimore. Right. We actually have a successful local business, Under Armour. Yeah. The guys made certain commitments. They got CVS Corporation to rebuild the pharmacy that famously went up in flames with the cop cars flaming up outside of it. They were able to entice a lot of chains, corporate outfits to come in and rebuild. And they've done nothing for the local people. There was 71 or 73 local business owners got together and they filed a class action lawsuit against Baltimore City because they're out of business. Right. They didn't care about that. They really wanted the individual business people to go away because there's a lot more to be gained if you're a government official from dealing with a corporation.
Oh, sure. Contributions, and you've got all that sort of centralized power that you can tap and you can push them around. I mean, every time a sports team moves to or threatens to move to a new city, it's like this big game that you see played out with the cities. They're negotiating with these big, because there's dollars and probably kickbacks and bribes involved. And it's not really necessarily going to the community, though. I mean, if you go to your stadium neighborhood and you look around, with a few exceptions, you don't see a lot of prosperity. And so it's just this kind of big scam that it happens between the big players, and the little people are left with nothing.
Well, there was a user submission. James, are you familiar with Chateau Artiste, artiste.wordpress.com?
I've read 2 articles that people linked to me from them. So earlier this summer, in June, someone sent in to Chateau like a user submission or reader submission regarding Baltimore. And it's a former Marine who lives there, moved there for work, I think. And he kind of describes very briefly that there's a small, it's kind of like what Detroit is now, where there's a small congregation of hipsters, and then they're rapidly just surrounded by sort of a black underclass that is very hostile to them. And he pretty much describes an incident where he gets almost carjacked,
and the carjacker, black guy, like slams him over the back of the head with his handgun a couple times, and then the Marine is able to stab him with the knife he has and push him down, and then send him going away.
Yes, I've had that story sent to me by 4 different readers, and I wrote an article in response to it.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, I wanted to get your take on it. I wanted to get your take if this is common, if there's or if it's becoming common that guys are defending themselves more and more in Baltimore, because it doesn't sound like based on your interview with Kevin Michael Grace, it sounds like what you described, the Baltimore PD is effectively there to prevent people from keeping criminals in line.
Yeah, yes, I would characterize it that way. I was critical of this former Marine for what? Yeah, the guy has a few beers. He's by himself. He's sitting in his car texting on a back lot in an area that is generally the focus of predation. He was in the Fells Point, I believe, which is right up against the water. It's only 4 blocks deep, and it's surrounded on the landward side by Perkins Homes, which is this 15,000 strong hood rat hatchery, and these kids just go out and rob people. He didn't any tactical awareness that he had overseas, he didn't bring it home with him, and he he paid for it. So now he knows differently. He learned. I did meet there was a fellow who was from a different branch of the service who saw my criticism, and he wrote into me. He said, "Well, I don't particularly care for Marines. I'm an Army guy, so why don't we get together for a beer sometime?" So I actually made a friend out of this. Okay, and he similarly, when he got back from the service, this fellow also was attacked by a group of people. They can tell when you're not from around there. Yeah. And it's not like they have a bunch of visual watermarks that they look for. They can just sense it. This is animalistic behavior. They know when you're not from there. When you come home from doing service or when you're new in town, just being who you are, nothing you do, but just being who you are is going to throw out a vibe. I don't know if it's smell or what. And you're more likely to be attacked.
No, that makes perfect sense. I mean, if you're going to live in a place for a period of time, you're going to pick up just subliminally the local habits. And then if you switch venues, you're going to actually still carry those habits with you. And everybody is going to not even be aware of their own habits being local, but they're going to see that you're carrying on in a different way. You haven't acclimated yet. So I think everybody has a sixth sense to just the little cues, like you're wearing it's a different style of clothing, or there's this accent to you, or there's always going to be a cue that is really just subconscious. Everybody can notice it though, and I think it's probably evolved that way so that we know when there's an outsider.
And there was also this other case I told you about. This returning serviceman also fought back and did so successfully. So that's great. It goes to tell you that something about their military experience did help them out when they got home, but it didn't prevent them both from being seriously injured. And number one, it didn't prevent them from getting into the scrap to begin with.
Right.
And these are two things that these guys were caught on. If I operated at their level of awareness, I would have been dead 25 years ago. I would have been killed 100 times over if I operated at that level of awareness. So they find out. In fact, when I met with the one fellow who survived a similar attack, only it was by a group of 5, he was on combat alert. He knew where the bar where we met was in a bad enough neighborhood that all the danger signs were flagging for him, and he didn't have his hardware with him that he had when he was on mission in Afghanistan, and it was freaking him out. It made it stressful for him, and he couldn't believe that I go in these places unarmed, because his level of anxiety demands a weapon, because he does he does know when he's in a bad spot. This guy's a couple of levels above the Marine. This was a spec ops guy that I was talking to. So he wouldn't have got bagged like the Marine did. He actually got nailed while he was walking along, and 5 dudes just kind of stormed him.
Right.
So it's, but still, he could have avoided that. There were things that he did because this wasn't his bag. He's used to patrolling in Afghanistan. He's not used to patrolling in Baltimore City. It was a whole different game. So I think that what you have to do as a man is to have a basic tactical package and modify it. You have to know that you're going to modify it wherever you go. When I go to different parts of Baltimore, I modify my behavior. When I'm in different settings, I modify my behavior. So you have to have a core package, awareness package that you use, and the rest of it is going to involve you actually looking like a hard target. What we were talking about before, having your head on a swivel and moving around even when you're staying in the same place. That type of vigilance really repels people from you, and it also gives you an opportunity to learn a lot about. For instance, you could notice the guys that were walking your way and then change their mind.
So tell us,
log that as your information.
Well, really quickly, Nick, I have 2 more things, and then I'll let you go. I had a somewhat similar experience of almost mugging I don't know, about 3 months ago in the city I live in, and they're actually on the train at about midnight. And effectively what happened was I was about 6 seats away from this black guy who got on 2 stops before my stop to get off was, and he all of a sudden he starts putting on a bandana and sunglasses. It's almost midnight, and then I see him putting on gloves, and he has a nice plastic bag, and he keeps reaching into it, like trying to feel if something's there. So immediately I'm just kind of staring at this guy, and there's a younger Hispanic guy with his girlfriend who's sitting closer to him, and then the black guy kind of walks towards the door of the train, which is where I'm sitting right next to, and he puts his hand into his bag. So I immediately just stand up and face him, and the Hispanic guy is watching the situation, and I kind of see him out of the corner of my eye stand up too, and he kind of moves his girlfriend behind him. And as soon as we're getting to the stop I'm getting off at, I see a black woman at the stop, and she starts signaling to this guy, and then she starts putting a bandana on too. So I immediately just get off the train, and the black guy didn't really do anything once I stood up and got in his face. Didn't say anything, although I had my right hand on my pocket, which is where I keep my knife. And the Hispanic guy dragged his girlfriend off and flagged me down as I'm walking away and said, hey man, like something's going on there. I said, yeah, something's going on. They're gonna rob people. They're gonna rob people. So we try and flag down a cop for about 10 minutes and couldn't find one. And then I went and got my car and went home. But I didn't hear anything the next couple of days about any train robberies or any muggings on the train. So I don't know what they were doing, if they were on their way to like kill someone, or if they were they robbed someone and they didn't report it. But I think that was the closest I've ever gotten to being mugged.
Good job.
Yeah.
Look, one thing you could do to improve it, and what I think you had there was whatever he got from whoever he got it from was going to get handed to her. Whether they were going to get somebody that she had flagged, people tend to hit somebody at the exit right where you were, to rob somebody right there, so you could have been the target, or they tend to hit somebody that's waiting at a stop. It could have been you that was the mark, or it could have been maybe some old dude was dozing off on the bench near where she was.
Right.
But in any case, she's going to make off with the goods while he goes in another direction. They're not going to leave together after they do whatever crime that they do. The one way that you could improve it, when you got to assume that they're armed.
Yeah,
okay?
I assumed he was.
Okay, so what you have to be is you've either got to be on their right side where the weapon is going to be accessed, so you could just keep it from popping out, okay? Or, and if it's not a weapon, he's going to hit you with that hand anywhere, so you want to be right there. Or you want to go to the other side so that his body is between you, the target, and that hand or that weapon. and it kind of depends on who you are and what kind of space you have. But anything but standing right in front of them. The one thing, what you did right there, standing right in front of them, if it would have been 2 or 3 of them, that would have been bad. Yeah. Because you're getting confrontation with the group. So you just want to be in a habit of taking the angle. You know, even if you can punch harder than the other dude and you're a boxer that I'm training, you still don't stand in front of him. You just want to take a little bit of an angle, and it's not much. You know, all you have to do is take the toes of your foot, either your left foot or your right foot, and slide it slightly to the outside of his foot on whichever side you're going to go to. Yeah. And that's it. So you could have, just by moving 6 to 10 inches to one side or the other, you could have actually made your response more foolproof. But it was enough that you were confrontational and he was not prepared for a confrontation.
Yeah. And the other thing I have was I looked up on neighborhoodscout.com just the general Baltimore crime rate, and they have more recent data. I think their crime index has Baltimore as safer than only 2% of other U.S. cities. So it's
safer than Camden,
Chicago,
and Michigan.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what ranks below it. I'm assuming like Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, but I mean the
Johannesburg.
Yeah, the number of crimes that they had, and I think this takes in 2016 data into account, is 41,020 crimes total. That's including property and violent crimes, and the majority of that, 31,444, is property.
Right. And some of them, I don't know what percentage. Some of that property crime is actually violent crime.
Like the violent crime national median is 3.8, and Baltimore sits at 15.4 per 1,000 residents.
Oh, I'm lucky to be in an interesting place.
So, how was it, James, that you developed these skills? Was this all self-taught? What brought you to this point?
I got beat up on my very first day of school in elementary school by 3 second graders. Then I got beat up by my teacher. This big blonde chick who pulled me up by the hair and was beating me like a piñata. So I immediately knew that the world was not what my parents told me it would be. Eventually, I got fed up with continually being beaten up and tortured by older people. And when I hit puberty young at age 11, and this happened to be the same day that my cousin unsuccessfully tried to drown me, and I was at home watching a Muhammad Ali fight. I hated Ali because he was just beating up and teasing smaller people. But there was a guy on the undercard, Roberto Duran, almost killed this dude with one punch, hit him in the liver, boom, gone, out on the stretcher. And I just looked at that and I said, I want to be able to do that. I want to be a boxer, and I wanted to be a boxer for that reason. So I got involved in boxing, was not a successful competitor, but I eventually, by the time I was 27, actually got good at it at the same time that I seriously injured my shoulder and was no longer able to compete. So I became a pretty good coach. As far as the survival skills go, I didn't start learning survival skills until I was really, I guess I started when I was 18, when I first moved back to Baltimore. Yes, so I seriously became a student of high-stress survival skills when I was age 30, and I started working outside of my neighborhood, and I would take 3 buses through different parts of Baltimore to get to my job at night. And this was when the crack epidemic first hit, and then the big heroin trade really started to bust loose in the 90s after that. This was in the early 90s that my life became hyper-violent because I was on bus stops in some of the worst parts of Baltimore at night. So that's all self-taught. All of the avoidance stuff and everything, that's self-taught. What I just talked that was Hans on the train, right?
Yeah, that was Hans.
That was Hans. Okay, what I just talked to Hans about was me adapting something that my boxing coach taught me, but I was always too stupid to apply. I finally adapted it in real life situations, and now I coach boxers on it, which is just cutting to the angle, stepping off, and that's the most important skill you can have in these survival situations. As far as the weapons go, I was just always naturally really comfortable with holding weapons in my hands, not firearms. Firearms have always freaked me out because I couldn't pull the bullet back if I shot at the wrong thing. I just always loved blades and sticks and clubs and things, and I practiced with them on my own when I was a teenager. I made swords and clubs. I made a sheet metal combat dummy that I put in my father's backyard that I used to attack. I would, anytime I could get somebody to actually play fight with me with weapons, I would always do it. And I finally formalized it when I was becoming too old to box. In 1998, I was working on a set of history of boxing books, and I noticed that the weapon postures of the ancient Greek boxers was pretty much the same as how they fought with their fists. So I wanted to explore the relationships between fighting with weapons and empty hands. So a couple of guys I knew, I asked them, would you like to fight with knives and sticks? And they were like, yeah, great. So we just started doing that, and eventually it built. And I've been doing it ever since. I still spar with my fighters. I'm not competing anymore. But I just learned it by doing. At certain times, I got some training. I actually paid a guy who was the number 2 middleweight in the world in stick fighting. I paid him for about 8 lessons. I initially decided to pay him as a sparring partner, just somebody to practice with, but he almost killed me. It was like being in a hurricane or something. It was ridiculous. So I basically paid him protection money so that he would beat me up and teach me, as opposed to just beating the shit out of me every time I showed up. I mean, that guy, it was just horrible. I actually had 11 bruises on one shoulder after one sparring section with him. I would just go home and sleep and piss blood and work until the next time I sparred with that guy for about 6 weeks. So I probably got my highest level of instruction there from this fellow, who was actually a financial consultant. That's what he does for a living, but his hobby was beating up people with sticks.
What would you say to somebody who wants to just learn how to defend themselves and doesn't want to get permanent brain damage in the process?
Well, you need to go to somebody that's actually fought and or trained fighters and who's not going to hurt you. You know, like, for instance, around here, I do that with people. If a guy tells me that he wants to be a competitive fighter, well, then I'll beat him up, or I'll have somebody beat him up just to see if he's going to be a waste of time or not. But if it's somebody, for instance, Ulrich Kerensky is his internet name, a fellow who came to Baltimore to get a boxing lesson from me. And the guy works in finance. And, you know, I knew this guy did not want to get hurt. So I worked with him. I didn't hurt him. And I found him a coach in the area that he lives in, who's a fellow that I coached. And I trust this guy not to hurt Ulrich. You know, the guy's got a valuable brain. He doesn't want brain damage. You can take, ideally, when you're training a competitive fighter, you don't want him to have a lot of contact right off the bat. You want to bring him along easy. At a certain point, he's going to have to get his face beat in to see if he's got the goods. But you don't want him to get glove shy. There's an advanced way of bringing somebody into this. So a person who understands this, who can actually deal with competitive fighters that aren't just specimens. You don't want to trust a coach that all of his guys are these naturally athletic dudes. You want to find a guy that actually has been able to manufacture high-level fighters out of pretty average raw material. They'll usually have a pretty good system for bringing somebody along easily and just let them know, look, you know, I want to do this for defense. I'm not interested in having my nose broken or my brain damaged, so could you please just you know, get me used to enough contact so that I don't flip out when I get hit. And because you have to. At some point, you're going to have to get hit. You're going to have to get roughed up. But that can be done to you in a manner that's not going to harm you. and it can be done by somebody that's capable of just murdering you. And that's what you really want. You want that guy. Ideally, what you want is the guy that beat the hell out of me and taught me. You want to hire a guy like that to teach you how to defend yourself and not beat you up.
You were telling me before the show that although you have written for places like Black Belt Magazine, that you would not describe yourself as a martial artist.
No, I'm not a martial artist. I don't have any rank in any system other than the honorary black sash I got from Arturo Gabriel so that I would beat the shit out of anybody that questioned his system. I mean, that's all that's about, you know. He trusts me, likes me.
Are you skeptical of formal systems like that? Do you think that
any formal system's bad at a certain spot? They all have something to offer. There's something valuable in all of them. But at a certain point, there's a rigidity that's just going to get you killed.
Well, they're designed for not killing each other, basically, because this is a sport, and so, you know, set aside the fact that you want the mom to sign up, you know, at the local dojo, and doesn't want her kid killed. Basically, it's supposed to have a reputation for, you know, safety and consideration, and there's also an honor code built into a lot of the East Asian martial arts.
Well, the history of those, I mean, they were about killing, but they were designed in a context that is definitely outdated. I mean, things like jiu-jitsu were grappling for people wearing heavy armor, and you see the same thing in Western martial arts from the Middle Ages and things like that.
Yeah, there's something valuable in all of them. I prefer the ones that permit certain levels of contact to those who don't. For instance, if you're interested, Nick, in getting some training with weapons, if you go somewhere where they're tapping sticks together and that's all they do, then don't go there. You want to go someplace where they actually have protective gear that you could put on so that somebody could hit you with a stick and not hurt you. Okay, because if your reference point is always hit the other guy's weapon, your whole training is calibrating your range to be off from anywhere from 6 inches to a foot.
Well, what you want is asymmetry. You want a situation where the guy has the stick, you've got the headgear on, and your job is to basically not get murdered or try to disarm him or something, or deflect him so you can run away. And then you can reverse it as well. That's what I would like in a training situation, because that's more realistic. You're going to be surprised, you know, by the attacker, and you're not going to have everything ready. And so I think, you know, learning how to fight asymmetrically is probably very useful.
Would you say that striking is more important to learn than grappling?
No.
No,
and I'm a striker. I'm not a grappler. I wrestled for a couple of years. I sucked. I can out-wrestle most normal people, but no. If you've got a choice, you want to be able to grapple, because anytime somebody hits you at the point of contact, you're in grappling range. Okay. The striking that's most important is to be able to deal with weapon strikes. As far as the asymmetrical and symmetrical training, I recommend mostly symmetrical training, because you actually learn defending against the weapon, without the weapon, and attacking with the weapon at the same time. And then you just drop the stick and say, okay, now I have the stick and you don't, and you go back and forth. So you actually get double learning when you're going symmetrically, because you're using a weapon and a weapon's coming at you. But you don't want to train as a duelist. You want to be able to train more practically. And what you'll find is the most valuable things that you'll learn in as far as asymmetrical combat is when you're sparring, you're going full speed and you lose your weapon. You always know when you're losing your weapon before the other guy knows it. So you have about a half a second to get him before he knows you're unarmed. So that way you can actually experience in spots asymmetrical combat at a competitive level, which is realistically what's going to happen when you're out there, because the other guy wants your wallet and you want to live. So I like doing all of it. And as a baseline, doing a lot of symmetrical training, and then just at odd points, if I'm the coach and I'm showing Nick how to stick fight, at a certain point, I'll just drop my stick and then begin trying to grapple with him. And now he's in a spontaneous situation that he didn't expect, where he has a stick and he's trying to prevent some goon from grappling with him. And at other points, when his stick drops, I won't drop my stick and I'll keep coming. And now he's in that asymmetrical situation that he didn't expect, where he's being attacked with a weapon. So you want to be able to use that weapon effectively before you start messing around with, how do I deal with a guy with a weapon? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
You know, and it's there's certain peak learning curve parts, and where you're going to learn the most. Okay, here's the way you look at boxing. Look at any boxing match, and you could take a self-defense situation out of it. You go to a point where some guy gets hurt with a punch. Well, that's how most self-defense situations happen. You got sucker punched. And then stop the tape, because just about every boxing match is on YouTube now, and look at the sequence that follows, which is only going to be seconds long, and it's going to end up featuring this guy surviving or this guy getting knocked out. And if it's a boxing match, 9 times out of 10, if he survives, it's because he grabbed a dude. But
is that why the ref is always there to break these guys up? I mean, you notice like in the big matches, a lot of these guys are afraid of one of the boxers, and they'll start hugging each other because they don't want to get crushed.
And it's become very bad. It used to be that boxers knew how to punch hard when they were grappling, and they knew how to break a clinch. Now, and Floyd Mayweather and Bernard Hopkins built their careers on this and their records on this. As of about 1990, the early 1990s, it became illegal, totally banned in amateur boxing to clinch. And on top of that, it became a penalty if you counter clinched. If the guy grabbed you and you shoved his hands apart and then hit him, that was a foul. You weren't allowed to do that anymore. So amateur boxing has taught boxers how not to defend the clinch for like 20 years. So those guys that learned in the amateur ranks in the 80s that stuck around for the early 2000s, they had a lot of soft prey. They could hit these guys and grab them anytime they wanted, and they didn't know how to break a clinch. So there's not many coaches that teach clinching and counter clinching, but in professional boxing, you're still allowed to break the clinch, and you're actually still allowed to clinch until the referee gets sick of it. So you can, what I suggest is to look at boxing matches from the 50s, 60s, and 70s that are on tape and up into the 80s, and study the clinch and KO sequences. And you can apply a lot of things yourself just by learning that. Look at when they grab each other, because it wasn't all the time, and look at how they break the clinches, and look at what happens when they get hurt. Yeah, you can extract a lot of self-defense situations out of that.
Who are good fighters from that era to watch?
Well, the best boxer to watch, if you're looking at the middleweight to welterweight range, Roberto Duran. Roberto Duran shows the biggest toolkit of any boxer from the era of color boxing film. So where you're not going to get some old grainy thing that's going to be hard to look at. Roberto Duran, plus he had 114 fights. There's a lot of footage. He fought from lightweight up to light heavyweight. You could see him fighting really big guys. Best fight you could watch Roberto Duran in would be Roberto Duran versus Iran Barkley. Iran Barkley could have been a heavyweight. He was a huge guy. His best friend, Davey Moore, died in a car accident, which people thought had something to do with the grief from his loss at the hands of Duran. And Duran savaged Davey Moore. So you want to watch Roberto Duran. The other one would be Marvin Hagler. You don't want to watch the boxers that a lot of people want you to watch. You don't want to watch somebody like Ali that gets everything done because he's bigger and faster and younger than the other guys, or somebody like George Foreman who's just so much stronger and more powerful than the other people. I would have to say Duran's the best guy that you could get a lot of reliable footage of now.
I was laughing because despite all this fight knowledge, James has never seen Fight Club, but that actually sort of leads me to my question: is that really just a bourgeois take of what all this is about? I mean, this was written by a guy from Oregon. I don't see a lot of street fighting going on there. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's not an urban thug.
Chuck Palahniuk was not a fighter himself.
No, of course not. So the book and the movie is basically about a guy. I'm not going to spoil it for you because it's an excellent movie, but it's basically a guy who is living the IKEA lifestyle. He's working at a job he hates. His boss is a buffoon, and basically he has no purpose in life and he can't sleep. So he ends up going to these weird like clinics to try to like relieve his insomnia. And he meets this guy on a plane named Tyler Durden, and he's the guy who's the avatar for Zero Hedge today. But basically, he's like the ultimate male. You know, he's the masculine personification of it. And he is this guy who does whatever he wants. You know, he looks how the guy wants to look. He fucks how the guy wants to fuck. I mean, this is a line from the movie, but basically, they get into this situation where the sort of narrator, the guy played by Edward Norton, meets this other guy played by Brad Pitt, and they become friends. It's sort of an odd couple pairing, but essentially they bond over the fact that there's something wrong with the system, and that this guy who's done everything right is miserable and he can't sleep, and he meets this guy who does nothing right by the system's rules, but he's the most successful guy that he's ever met. And they build this thing called Fight Club, which is essentially bringing people back to the primal masculine nature of man, and the movie goes from there. But you know, without seeing it, it's sort of hard to do this, but I'm curious what your take on it is, because it's a glamorization of the male, obviously, and a rejection of the sort of feminization of him, and it's kind of an anarchist film, in my opinion, as well, and it frowns on any sort of civilization, and so there's a lot of really interesting meaning to it, and everybody has a different spin on that. But that's what it's about, and maybe you other guys can jump in to clarify for James, who has yet to see it, ironically.
I will watch it. I promise I will watch it. What struck me, you were talking about the two guys that didn't seem to have a lot in common, but they had in common, alienation from the, our world order.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's any of these groups I've been involved with. If you're getting to the level where guys are willing to get hit, where they're not just showing up for self-defense, and they're also not a guy that's going to be the next Ray Robinson and make millions of dollars, then you're looking at an oddball group of guys. One gym I was at, you've got a bar owner, you got a kid in high school, we've got a pharmacist. The pharmacist is never going to even be able to compete, but he's basically the on-site medic. You got me, I was a grocer, washed up and over the hill. We had a pro fighter, we had an amateur competitor. That's just one gym. Racially, we've been in gyms where we've had, I think, with 7 people, we've represented, I think, everything but the Ikung Bushmen and the Australian Aborigines. I mean, you pretty much had like every race present in one session and not that many people. So you're looking at just a willy-nilly cross-section of people that are coming together. If they're going to learn to fight for a reason other than I don't want to get my wallet stolen and I want to be the next welterweight champion.
Yeah, I mean, these guys start fighting for the most part because they're sort of desperate to just get into a fight, and it's implied that a lot of them have never been in a fight before. I mean, there's a scene early on where Durden says to the narrator, "I've never been in a fight. Have you?" And he says, "No." So just hit me as hard as you can. Like, there's a whole generation of men who have, I guess, even in school days, just never been hit in the face or never punched anyone in the face, and were sort of desperate to
it's
feel what it was like.
Because when I was a kid and I saw that movie first thing me and my friends did was try to start a fight club behind the gym. It didn't last. It didn't last long. But
I got into a really bad fight in 7th grade with some Korean kid, and he hit me really hard in the eye. And in response, just sort of threw a knee into his stomach, and then it goes into grappling and wrestling on the ground. And you get up, and then you realize, okay, you're fighting over, like nothing, and then you're friends going forward.
That's funny. Actually, I became friends with almost all the people I got into fights with. It's really funny you say that.
Yeah, me too.
I don't know if that's the nature of men, because I've heard women, hate each other until their grave, but it's basically it's somewhat like common experience I've heard.
On that point, James, are you familiar at all with the work of Jack Donovan?
Yes, he reviewed one of my books,
Taboo
You.
Huh.
And he liked parts of it, and he disagreed with my non-hierarchical, the fact that I didn't think that masculinity should be strictly hierarchical. And my criticism of his stuff was that he looks at things too strictly hierarchical, which is not authentic tribalism, because tribal societies have set-aside positions. It's not just a meritocracy pyramid. So other than that, I think we agree on a whole lot of stuff.
Right. I'll try to find. We'll link the listeners to his review. And did you write a response to that publicly?
He wrote his review. I was a real total prick here, so he wrote his review, and I liked it, and I appreciated the 1,400 readers. Okay, because that doubled my readership at the time. And at the end of his review, James has encouraged me to perhaps write another book on masculinity. So in the next 2 months, I wrote 3. I just buried him. I actually predicted where he was going with his line of inquiry. Incubus of Your Sacred Emasculation was the next book I wrote. I dedicated it to him. He basically gave me the idea of it with his critique of my position, and I basically wrote his book. Okay, and then I wrote a sequel and another sequel. What
are those sequels called?
Okay, the sequels are called The Third Eye and The End of Masculine Time. Both small books. They are all collected. Okay, Incubus of Your Sacred Emasculation, The Third Eye, and The End of Masculine Time are all collected in a book titled The God of Things, Under the God of Things. And the cover of it, I found an open domain graphic of this guy feeding a bunch of cattle at a feedlot. So it's Under the God of Things as the omnibus with those 3 books in it. And I think I put about 60 pages of new essays in there also, including Against the Goddess. So, yeah, I was a total prick there. I went and, I was like, okay, this guy's going to write another book. So I'll just strip mine everything that's in front of him. So,
well, in Masculinity Axis, you have 2 breakdowns of men. So you break it down pretty early on that there's three kinds of men. There's either alphas, betas, or omegas. Is that accurate?
That's my concept, and I realize it doesn't go with the Huxley lettering system. Basically, leaders, followers, and then alienated types, learners.
Right. And within that, then there's 4 masculine states. So there's a wild, primal, domesticated, and feral. Could you elaborate on those a little bit for us?
Okay. Well, the wild would be an uncultivated pre-tribal person, a person that's living in a band situation, somebody that only has a family orientation. As far as I know, those people don't exist anymore. The primal would be the type of tribalism that a lot of us discuss, where you have a culture and it's pre-state. The feral, that's what I'm dealing with here. That's who my enemies are. These are, these are people that either are not suited for civilization, or civilization has decided to twist them and corrupt them into these little pit bull human beings so that they can be set upon whoever does not, go along with the line, whatever the line is.
How exactly, James, would you define civilization?
It's a way to turn everybody into a woman, except for the people at the top. I mean, civilization really starts when you get an agrarian tribal society that's maybe got a priest king, okay, that's got to the point where they haven't, the shaman is morphed into a priest and is taking advantage of things by leading. You have something like a Gilgamesh situation. And then they get conquered by usually nomads. And you end up with the aristocracy, are the only ones that are allowed to hunt, usually the only ones that have access to much meat, which is unnatural, but it allows them to keep their pride at place. A good example of these two things is when you had the Zulus, when they fought the British down in South Africa. You got a bunch of 6 foot tall Zulu men who are herders who eat meat. Then you've got them fighting these 5 foot 6 inch Welsh guys who ate bread all their life, hardly ever had any meat. They have stunted growth. And these 5.5 foot tall guys are being officered by 6 foot tall English officers who grew up eating a broad-based diet, which included a lot of meat. And so what you have when you have a bunch of diggers, when you have a bunch of farmers, when they get conquered by somebody like the Zulus, eventually you end up with a society like the English had, like the British had, where you've got the people on top still have a nice broad-based diet. They're still eating meat, not at a primitive level, but enough to have some decent musculature. And they're ruling over this stunted mass. When Europeans came to the U.S., the size of the American Indians astonished them. When you look at the old woodcuts and illustrations of American Indians from a few hundred years ago, they look like they could be extras for the road warrior, and they're eating a meat diet and they have vegetables and everything too. And the Europeans, the poor ones, have just grown up basically just eating grain, which isn't natural for humans, but the grass-based society serves the ruling class because it feeds all their animals, and that was their war machines back then, the horses. It also continues to feed them the meat that they had when their ancestors were herders, and it feeds the grain directly to the peasants. So you got the slave class is eating the same shit that the animals are eating, the grain, the grass. And then you've got the ruling class squatting on top of them. Europeans learned to hunt in North America from the natives because there was no European hunting tradition amongst the people who came here. Because the only people that hunted were the gamekeepers and the aristocracy.
Do you think that this country, the North American continent, could in the future be, or at least portions of it could be conquered by basically roving barbarian tribes?
I hope so. I'd spent time out west with this fellow, my guide, Ishmael, and we're looking around at things. And this is a guy with Norwegian heritage, but he thinks more like an Indian. And one of the guys he grew up with was part Sioux. What we've done with the water supply out there to feed cattle that are of Middle Eastern origin in an area that better tasting meat that consumes half of the water could still be grazing and we could be hunting them, the bison. It's really kind of ridiculous. Now, one thing I would like to point out, one of the books I'm working on is called Yellow Negroes and White Indians. I found significant evidence of people from the Indian subcontinent and China being enslaved in Maryland and Virginia around 1700. The other thing that I've found, as I've always loved reading about the exploration of North America. Start searching artwork depictions of Native American chiefs from before 1800. They all look like a bunch of white guys with war paint on. And the people that did these illustrations and paintings, they did realistic art. If you look at the animals that they drew, it's all realistic. And for much of the history of the clash between the whites and I'll definitely prove this in the book, it's going to be easy, between the whites and the Indians, what you had was mixed race Indian tribes. The Iroquois nation stayed, and the Shawnee stayed in close contact with European invaders for 250 years and did not succumb to the diseases that wiped out the Aztecs in a year. They adopted to replace losses due to disease, and the adoption increased their immunity. It also made them part European. So, and there's a lot of evidence that guys would get on these ships, guys without jobs that were going to be sold as plantation chattel anyhow, would actually enlist on ships like Magellan's voyage with plans of just jumping ship as soon as they hit alien shores, anything to get the hell out of Europe. And they wanted to go native. There were 100 guys who were set down at the mouth of the Rio Grande between Texas and Mexico after Drake and Hawkins lost their battle to the Spanish at Veracruz. 100 of these guys started walking east. Only 3 of them made it to Cape Breton in Canada, and they ended up getting picked up. According to them, all of the Indian tribes treated them nicely and had them as guests because all these people hated the Spanish because the Spanish had already been up in there. But only 3 of them made it. Most of them just decided to stay because you got a lot of decent quality pussy, for one thing, and you didn't have a master. So you had so many white people. The guy that engineered the greatest defeat of U.S. Army forces against Native Americans, the Native American chief that was most successful against the U.S. Army, was a guy named Blue Jacket. He was 100% Dutch. He ran away from home, wanted to be an Indian. And the guy with the second most successful battle record against the United States was Crazy Horse, a well-known Indian chief who always refused to have his photo taken. And according to Miss Sandoz, who knew him as a child, he had brown hair and blue eyes. And his tribesmen called him the Strange One. So you got a lot of history of white Indians fighting against the establishment. And it's more than enough I'm going to be able to fit in one book. So I think it can happen again. And
will it be different this time, though? Because, well, the Civil War proved that the establishment is willing to do what it takes to keep its power.
Right.
And that was compared to the Indians, that was an industrialized army, even though compared to the North, they weren't as powerful. Right. But looking forward, this is always difficult because nobody really knows, but the technology and the money power and the printing press that they have access to, that the establishment controls, is a tall order to fight.
Well, look at what some barefoot guys with AK-47s have been able to do to this empire.
Yeah, they're doing it outside the borders, and they're doing it in a territory that they know and control, and they're doing it in a place where the empire doesn't make any money, really, and so it's basically just a giant failure for them. But, if you talk about the United States, where the economy
the empire makes quite a bit of money from Afghanistan.
Well, not really.
My opinion is
I don't agree with that analysis, but I think they lose more money. There are segments of it that make money, but the net effect to the government's budget is negative. Sure, there's the CIA or who's running drugs that is taking their cut, but the cost to the country is way higher than whatever they're making out of that place. Anyway, so I'm just saying, maybe that's what it's going to take. Maybe there's going to be this just giant collapse brought on by the bankruptcy of the empire, because that's what happened to Rome. But when and what do you do as an individual? That's tough. I don't know if we can get on our horse and shoot a bow and arrow through our local corrupt official, but it's and actually pull this off. But it's a tough one. It's a tough one.
Well, before there's a collapse, I don't see how you fight it. There's a lot of guys I know that are into the whole idea of, for instance, Appalachians rising again. All these guys basically with Indian skills, all these deer hunters, the population from which our military combatants are drawn, the guys on the point of the spear, they're either urban thugs, but primarily they're rural guys that come with a pre-existing skill set for handling long guns. Those guys aren't coming home and just getting a job at the local gas station. they're becoming military contractors. And I ran into 4 military contractors during the riots. These 4 really scary dudes with no insignia on their generic black tactical uniforms. Yep. So, these guys are going to get, not only do I believe that the U.S. military would be used against U.S. citizens in the near future, I believe that Homeland Security and the DOD are already using and prepositioning a lot of former military combatants as contractors to go after anybody that's going to want to try to fight this government.
Of course, so that's the model today, because that gives them plausible deniability, cuts the responsibility and the liability, and they can just say, "Oh well, it was the company that did it. It wasn't us. We're not using them anymore." Then they set up shop, and it's the same bullshit they do in the hedge fund industry. One guy blows out the fund. And then they close the fund down. They open another up. They call it some Blackstone derivative name, and then it's a new shop, and they get funded again.
Blackwater became the Academy.
Yeah, Academi, after Eric Prince bailed out.
Right, and I talked to some guys that ran before and after it, and so no, I don't think that this country, I don't think it can be fought from within, but I think it's eventually going to implode. Right. I don't want to be the guy causing trouble when the American legions are called home. I can tell you that. If all the military force we had overseas came home to sort things out, I wouldn't want to be on the other end of that.
Well, James, what would you say about the, I don't know if you're aware, but there was a study released earlier this year, a 40-year study on the collapse in Western testosterone levels, like a 52% decline in sperm concentration. I'm sorry, this is a sperm count collapse. But there's also been numerous studies on testosterone collapse, specifically in the United States. What would you say about that? Would you say that having sort of an influx of our foreign legions abroad coming home would be able to solve a lot of these problems for us? Because there aren't a lot of men left in America who I think have the stones, literally, to start trying to solve anything.
I think it's more psychological than chemical or dietary. Right. Okay, just based on what happens to guys when they go into the Marine Corps boot camp at Parris Island. Their testosterone hits the floor right as they enter, and then when they leave, they got a whole lot more than normal testosterone. I think the T count's 25% for men graduating college now than it was in the 70s, and that's really huge. That's really huge when you think about the difference in testosterone. I think the difference in black and white testosterone is 17%. So that's a generational difference that's bigger than that racial difference.
Right.
So that's a big deal. But I think it's predominantly psychological. It has to do with our type of schooling, the fact that our society has just become this feminine pecking order. And I would like to see all those armies come home and not be overseas, and to have more than half of those guys decide that they didn't want to be slaves. But that's kind of a fantasy.
Well, two of the biggest determinants of testosterone in particular are sleep and stress levels. And it's pretty well known that whites and to an extent Asians in America have much higher levels of sleep deprivation and much higher levels of stress. So I don't know if it's something about the black and to an extent Hispanic lifestyles that makes it a lot easier for them to retain these higher testosterone levels.
I buy that because I've personally experienced that. Last week I only had 10 hours sleep. I think that's why I got sick. Right. And I've had a real hard time keeping weight off, keeping fat from accumulating, which means that, I'm lacking the muscle to burn calories in a sitting position. And it's because of the sleep deprivation. I know that. But one thing, though, all the strength sports still belong to people from Northern Europe. That's watch the strong, man. I mean, and but yeah, the testosterone count I think is going to continue to be suppressed if things keep going the way they are. And I see myself as being involved in an attempt to reverse that.
And you open the door and you step inside. We're inside our hearts. Now imagine your pain is a white ball of healing light. That's right, your pain, the pain itself, is a white ball of healing light. I don't think so. This is your life, good to the last drop. Doesn't get any better than this. This is your life, and it's ending 1 minute at a time. This isn't a seminar, this isn't a weekend retreat. Where you are now, you can't even imagine what the bottom will be like. Only after disaster can we be resurrected. It's only after you've lost everything that you're free to do anything. Nothing is static. Everything is evolving. Everything is falling apart. This is your life, this is your life, this is your life, this is your life. Doesn't get any better than this. This is your life, this is your life, this is your life, this is your life. And it's ending 1 minute at a time. You are not a beautiful and unique snowflake. You are the same decaying organic matter as everything else. We are all part of the same compost heap. We are the all singing, all dancing crap of the world. You are not your bank account. You are not the clothes you wear. You are not the contents of your wallet. You are not your bowel cancer. You are not your grande latte. You are not the car you drive. You are not your fucking khakis. You have to give up. You have to give up. You have to realize that someday you will die. Until you know that, you are useless. I say, let me never be complete. I say, may I never be content. I say, deliver me from Swedish furniture. I say, deliver me from clever art. I say, deliver me from clear skin and perfect teeth. I say, you have to give up. I say, evolve, and let the chips fall where they may. This is your life, this is your life, this is your life, this is your life. Doesn't get any better than this. This is your life, this is your life, this is your life, this is your life. And it's ending 1 minute at a time. You have to give up. You have to give up. I want you to hit me as hard as you can. I want you to hit me as hard as you can. Welcome to Fight Club. If this is your first night,